The alarm was already going off when I hit the floor, not the soft chime of a morning reminder, the old emergency frequency, the one they only broadcast when something had gone so wrong that every retired soldier, sailor, and pilot in the human colonies needed to hear it. At the same time, I had not heard that sound in 11 years, and the moment it reached my ears, my body moved before my brain finished waking up. My name is Alar Vasquez, Sergeant First Class, United Colonial Marines, retired, 22 years of active service, 2 full-scale conflicts, 3 deployments, 2 contested space, 1 severely reconstructed knee from the siege of Io, and a pension that barely covered rent in the lower residential ring of New Cartagena. New Cartagena was a human colony that the Galactic Conclave tolerated the way a wealthy landlord tolerates a cracked window in a building he does not particularly like and has no immediate plans to repair, aware of it, mildly inconvenienced by it, and entirely unbothered about the timeline for doing something about it. I was 44 years old. I worked 3 days a week at Dock 7, sorting and moving cargo for a shipping operation whose owners I had never met and whose cargo I did not ask about. The other 4 days I maintained the necessary fiction that the quiet life suited me. It did not, and it never had. Veterans do not retire cleanly. You step away from the structure and then spend the next decade carrying it with you, the way your tongue keeps finding the gap where a tooth used to be probing, the absence without meaning to, unable to simply stop. The broadcast filled my apartment with cold blue light at 4 in the morning, a galactic conclave emergency channel, force broadcast through every communications node in settled space, regardless of local permissions or user preferences. On the screen, a Keth delegate, tall, pale, gray, 4 amber eyes that tracked independently of each other, was speaking, measured, unhurried tone that old civilizations have learned to use when they want to project calm while something important is burning. The breath Dominion had crossed the border. I poured water from the tap into a cup and stood in my kitchen, listening without sitting down. The breath were a cephalopod empire, 40 systems wide, with a military history that stretched back 2,000 years. They had expanded before, slowly and methodically, with the patience of something that does not need to hurry because it has decided the outcome in advance. 3 human colony worlds had gone completely dark in 6 days, not captured and held in the way that an occupying force captures and holds territory. Gone, the conclave's unified military force, the Aegis fleet, had engaged the breath advance at the Pele system and been turned back so quickly that the after-action report I would read later sounded less like a military document and more like a person trying to describe a very bad dream while still in the middle of it. The KE delegate finished his prepared remarks and opened the emergency session for questions from member species. A human ambassador named Conrad Haley, young and clearly aware that he was the least experienced person in the room, raised his hand and offered humanity's military support. He was precise and professional about it. He cited our operational history and the colonial defense campaigns. He noted our equipment capabilities and our deployment readiness. He was everything a formal diplomatic representative is supposed to be. The KE delegate's response was 3 seconds of silence, which is a measurably long time in a formal chamber session and carries its own kind of message than the response itself in the carefully modulated language of polite institutional refusal, declining our offer with what I can only describe as decorated indifference. The KE military advisor was less diplomatic. She stepped to the podium and said in the galactic trade language that any species with a functioning communications node could parse, that human warriors were in her assessment short-lived, emotionally volatile, and structurally unsuited to the kind of sustained strategic patience that a conflict of this scale demands. She delivered this the way you explain something obvious to someone who should already understand it but clearly does not. Conrad Haley, to his credit, did not react visibly. He sat back in his seat with a particular stillness of someone who has been trained to absorb an insult without responding to it in a setting where response would cost more than the insult did. I watched his face on the broadcast and thought that he was going to have a very long career in diplomacy if he kept that up, because that quality is rarer than it looks. The chamber did not erupt in laughter. That was the more precise truth of it. It was more subtle than that the kind of quiet that spreads when a room full of people who share a common opinion have had that opinion confirmed in a satisfying way, the kind of quiet that is the social equivalent of a nod. Nobody needed to laugh out loud because the mood did it for them. I turned up the volume slightly and watched the rest of the session. 3 other species offered more direct military assistance and were more off diplomatically. Declined a 4th species whose civilization I knew primarily from trade records said nothing at all, which is sometimes the most informative kind of contribution to a public session. She was not wrong about our lifespan. I want to be fair about that. A Keth lives 4 centuries, a breath can reach 6. We average 80 years on a good run. By galactic time scales we are brief. What she had failed to understand, what none of them had spent any serious time considering, was what it does to a person to know from the very first day they put on a uniform and begin to understand what service actually means, that they will almost certainly not live to see the long view, what that knowledge builds in a person, how it changes the quality of attention a person brings to the present moment, when the present moment is all they are ever fully guaranteed. But she was not interested in that. None of them were. The clip spread across every human network within 2 hours. By morning Keth broadcast personalities were performing impressions of human soldiers stumbling around in oversized gear. A breath cultural analyst posted a long essay arguing with genuine intellectual sincerity that our offer of assistance represented a form of well-meaning but dangerous naivety that the conclave was right to decline before it introduced chaos into what needed to be a cold and calibrated response. A mid-tier conclave comedy program ran a segment about humanity's adorable martial ambitions that was shared widely enough that I saw it myself before I finished my first cup of water that morning. The laughter was genuine. It was not cruelty performed for an audience. They honestly believed it. Across 900 species and 4,000 inhabited worlds, we were the week's most widely shared joke. The small, emotional species with the short lives, raising their hands in a session full of ancient civilizations offering to help with something that had already beaten The best fleet in organized space. I turned off the screen. I sat in the dark. For a while in the particular silence of an apartment at 4 in the morning when the rest of building is asleep and the only sound is the background mechanical hum of ventilation systems doing their quiet useful work. My knee ocked it. Always ocked deep in the joint constant. The kind of pain you stop noticing only because it is always there, the way you stop noticing a particular smell in a room you have lived in for years. I had a partial reconstruction after I.O. and the reconstruction had held for a decade, which was better than many outcomes and worse than none at all. Holding and healed are different things. My body understood the distinction even when I chose not to think about it. I thought about the breath. I had read intelligence briefings about them during my last tour when their border movements first started drawing flags. Their military doctrine was a product of 2,000 years of refinement tested against real adversaries, adjusted through real failure, polished down to something that was by any theoretical measure extraordinarily close to optimal. Their supply chains could sustain a front for decades. Their tactical formations were layered and interlocking and built to absorb pressure from any predicted angle. Their commanders planned not in days or months but in years because they had the years to spend. The Aegis fleet turning back after one engagement told me something the official report had declined to say directly. The breath had not just won a battle, they had made the finest organized military force in the conclave feel afraid. At a deep structural level, there is a difference between losing a battle and losing your confidence in the same moment, and whatever happened at Pella had accomplished both simultaneously. My communicator lit up on the counter. Message from a man named Owen Drake, former gunnery sergeant, 6 years of shared service before his discharge. He ran a small transport company out of the Callisto hub now, good with logistics, very good with people. The message he had sent me was 4 words: you hearing this frequency? I typed back since 400. He replied with a coordinate and a time stamp. No explanation, none was needed. The coordinate was not a government address and not a conclave facility and not any official colonial defense site. It was a mustering location, the kind assembled quietly using old authentication codes embedded within the emergency broadcast, codes that only people who had served in the colonial military would know how to recognize and read. Someone had activated the old network, not a committee, not a government, not a conclave delegation or a colonial authority or any institution with formal standing. Just the old signal going out on the old frequency to everyone who had ever answered it before. I looked at the corner of my room where my old kit bag sat on a shelf. It had been there for 2 years, dusty with a small rust spot on one buckle that I had been meaning to clean for most of those 2 years without ever getting to it. I had walked past it every day and successfully pretended it was storage. I crossed the room and picked it up. I checked the contents, replaced 2 items that had degraded in storage, and repacked everything in the efficient compressed arrangement that military training installs so deeply it becomes automatic. My hands remembered the sequence without being asked. My knee ached the bag and walked out the door into the New Cartagena morning. The air was cool and smelled of the city starting its early shift in the orbital lanes above. The cloud layer transit ships were moving in the precise patterns of the morning rush, carrying the ordinary business of people living ordinary lives. I stood on the street for one moment and looked up at all of it. Then I started walking toward Dock 7. Galaxy had decided we were a joke. Fine. Jokes do not stay in place when called. Jokes do not remember 11-year-old authentication codes and check their kit at 4 in the morning and walk out into the cold with a bad knee and a clear destination. I was not theater. I was someone who had been sitting still for 11 years, and I was done sitting still. And the Galaxy was about to spend considerable time revising its opinion. The MUS station at Dock 7 had not held a military function in 14 years. In the time since it had been a freight processing center, a short-lived storage rental operation, and most recently a large empty warehouse that a private shipping company used as a vehicle holding area between contracts. There was a faded painted logo on the north wall from the storage rental period, and 2 overhead lights that had burned out and not been replaced because nobody important enough to complain had spent enough time in the building to notice them. By the time I arrived at 600, 230 people were already inside. By 800 the count had passed 600, and the intake processing team was asking someone to find more forms. By noon they had run out of forms entirely, and a retired Army logistics officer named Percy Akefer had taken over the vehicle park outside without being asked. When I arrived, the park had been a disorganized tangle of personal transports and cargo carriers arriving in overlapping waves with no clear routing or parking structure. 40 minutes after Percy Akefer walked in and assessed the situation, it was organized, labeled, and running smoothly enough that vehicles were processing through in less than 3 minutes each. He had done this using nothing but his own judgment, a length of bright orange safety tape he had found coiled around a support post, and a voice that had spent 20 years giving instructions that people followed without needing them repeated. That, in the simplest terms I can offer, was the thing that the KE military advisor had failed to account for, and that no outside analysis of human veterans had ever adequately captured. We do not need someone to specify every task. We have spent years, sometimes many years, in environments where the work that needs doing is not always the work that has been formally assigned, and where waiting for explicit instructions can mean waiting past the point where the instructions would have helped. We read situations, and we act not because we are undisciplined, because we are trained so thoroughly that the discipline is no longer external. It has become internal. It has become instinct. A woman named Gloria Sands arrived with her construction hard hat still on her head. She had been supervising a concrete pour when the frequency broadcast reached her, and she had left immediately because some things take priority over a concrete pour. She had been a Navy combat engineer for 16 years. She set the hard hat on the intake table, signed her name in the processing log, picked up her kit packet, and moved to the engineering coordination area without asking. It was because she had already identified it from the door. Stories like that were arriving from every colony system with a communications node, old reserve sites being activated, converted civilian facilities filling up, veterans in their 50s and 60s arriving alongside veterans in their 30s, all of them moving with the particular quality of purpose that long service installs in a person's posture, and that civilian life dims but does not fully extinguish people who had built lives and jobs and routines and had every rational reason to stay exactly where they were and watch from the safety of distance. They were not watching from a distance. A retired Army doctor named Philip Crane arrived at the Dock 7 medical intake point and within 2 hours of arriving had reorganized the entire medical processing section that had been set up by someone with good intentions and limited experience in field medical triage. He did not ask anyone's permission. He did not hold a meeting or produce a proposal. He assessed the layout, identified 3 specific inefficiencies that were already causing bottlenecks and fixed them one by one in the way that a person fixes things when they have spent 30 years in military medicine and know exactly what bottleneck costs when the stakes go up. When the person who had originally set up the section came back and found it reorganized, he stood looking at the new layout for a moment and then simply said, "This is better," and started working within it. That was what the 47 million looked like in practice, not the spectacle of it, not the raw number, which was extraordinary enough on its own, but the texture of it. Thousands of individual people arriving at thousands of locations and doing without being asked the thing that needed doing, guided by decades of training that had become something indistinguishable from instinct. No central coordinating body was directing this. No committee had planned the medical triage reorganization or Perseo's parking solution or what happened that afternoon when a retired communications specialist named Renee Booker arrived at the operations center and spent 4 hours quietly untangling the routing confusion that had been slowing the coordination network, leaving the system running clean before she ate anything or sat down. I walked through the Dock 7 facility on the afternoon of the second day, and what I saw was not chaos being managed. It was competence operating at scale, self-organizing, real time, each person finding their function the way water finds its level, not because they had been told where to be, because they knew where they were needed and went there. Owen Drake found me near the planning area on the second day. He was heavier than the last time I had seen him, with a gray beard that had not existed 3 years ago and the same absolutely steady eyes. We had not spoken in almost a year. He crossed the room, looked at me, and did not say anything dramatic, because Owen Drake had never said anything dramatic in his deal. He asked. Yes, I said. Good, he said. Means you will stay back and think before you do something fast and stupid. We both understood that this was not a reliable prediction, but it was offered with genuine warmth, and I accepted it. In that spirit, the numbers that were coming in from across the colonies were becoming difficult to hold in the mind as a single coherent fact. Every hub that had received the broadcast was reporting the same phenomenon: people showing up, not new recruits seeking adventure, veterans, people who had already paid the price of service and understood precisely what they were agreeing to pay again, people with mortgages and medical conditions and families and careers who had nonetheless picked up their gear and answered the free frequency as though 11 years had been 11 minutes. By the time the full count reached its stable number 3 days after the broadcast, 47 million human Veterans had responded across 12 colony systems, 47 million. The number was so large that it resisted being understood as a human fact at first. Statistics at that scale become abstract. What made it real was the texture of it, the individual pieces. Philip Crane, reorganizing a medical intake section without permission because it needed reorganizing. Percy Akeffer with his Orange Tape, a retired communication specialist named Renee Booker, who had arrived at our operations, sent her on. The second day spent 4 hours quietly untangling a routing mess that had been slowing coordination, and fixed it before she ate or sat down. Each of them a single life that had served, come home, built something else, and was now here again for reasons that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with choice. I had a brief conversation that evening with a man named Daniel Hall, who had served 4 years in colonial infantry and spent the past 8 years running a hardware supply business on the second ring. He was 41. His wife had asked him that morning. He said, not with anger or fear, but with genuine curiosity, why he was going. He told me he had stood in their kitchen thinking about it and had eventually answered, because if I do not go and something happens that could have been prevented, I will spend the rest of my life knowing I was here and did nothing. His wife had nodded, and he said she had packed him a bag. That conversation stayed with me because it said something plainly that I had not found the words for myself, not the drama of it, the simplicity, the clear, undecorated understanding that some situations require the people who can act to act, and the recognition that you are one of those people, and the decision to accept that rather than find a way to set it aside. That was what 47 million people had decided, not through orders or political pressure or collective social momentum, each one alone in a kitchen or an apartment or a cargo hauler or a construction site at 4 in the morning or at noon picking up a bag, because the frequency had reached them and they recognized it. The Conclave Intelligence Services filed a report the morning the count crossed 20 million. The lead analyst described the mobilization as a symbolic emotional response consistent with established human behavioral patterns during periods of perceived cultural dismissal. She predicted that the practical difficulties of self-organizing a force of this size without formal institutional support or official supply chain access would cause the mobilization to lose operational momentum within a week, at which point the symbolic statement would have been made and the participants would return to their civilian lives. The lead analyst had clearly never met Percy Akeffer or watched him solve a parking problem with Orange Tape. The logistics of what we were building should have been, by any reasonable analysis, completely unmanageable. No conclave, supply contracts, no access to the secured equipment channels that EGA's fleet units used, no government procurement mechanisms, no official authorization for military activity in the conflict zone. What we had instead was civilian transports, the personal equipment that veterans had maintained over the years, because the habit of maintaining your gear does not disappear when your papers are filed, and the accumulated creative problem-solving capacity of 47 million people who had spent their entire service careers learning to build what they needed from what was available. An 81-year-old former Army field engineer named Wallace Price arrived at the new Cartagena staging area on the morning of the second day, carrying 3 large, spiral-bound notebooks. He had not slept. He sat down at the only available table in the far corner of the operations area and spent 4 hours doing calculations in pencil, and what emerged from those 4 hours was a complete redesign of our orbital staging platform layout that accommodated the mixed civilian-military vessel configuration we were actually working with rather than the standardized military configuration the existing layout had been designed for. His handwriting was difficult. His mathematics was perfect. By the time our platform coordinators had verified his calculations, they were already implementing the redesign because it was clearly better than what we had, and waiting to be certain felt like waste. I watched that happen from across the room and felt the specific satisfaction of watching something you already understood to be true get demonstrated in front of people who needed the demonstration. Wallace Price himself said almost nothing about it when the platform coordinators confirmed his design was being implemented. He nodded, once closed his notebooks, and asked where the food was. He ate a standard field ration standing up in the corridor, looked back at the operations area once as he finished, and went to find a cot. He slept for 5 hours. Then he came back and asked what else needed solving. That was the rhythm of the second and third days. Problem encountered, problem solved, person moved to the next problem. A retired Navy structural engineer named Cassie Dunner spent 14 hours designing a field repair protocol for the civilian vessels in our fleet that had not been built to military specifications, working with 2 other engineers she had never met before and who had been recommended to her by other veterans in the facility through the informal network that had been operating continuously since day 1. The protocol was tested on 3 vessels on the second afternoon and worked. By the end of the third day, it was being used fleet-wide. Nobody had told Cassie Dunner to do that. She had looked at the fleet, seen the maintenance problem, and done the thing that needed doing. This was not done through any formal process. My old squad had simply begun treating me as their commanding officer from the moment we were in the same location, in the natural way that experienced soldiers recognize competence and organizational authority and act accordingly without waiting for documentation. The facts spread the way these facts spread in military environments through behavior rather than announcement. When a young logistics coordinator named Nate Freeborn came to me with a transport routing conflict on the 3rd morning and waited for my decision rather than escalating elsewhere, the question of what my role was had already resolved itself into something that no longer required discussion. I resolved the conflict, sent Nate back to his coordination table, and stood for a moment, taking in the full scope of what was being built around me, the organized chaos of 47 million people who knew exactly what they were doing it without any central authority telling them how. Nate Freeborn was 29 years old. He had served 2 years in the Colonial Defense before his discharge and had been working logistics for a construction company since then. When I noticed what he was doing at the coordination table 4 hours in, transport routing already significantly improved, I asked him how he had identified the problem so quickly. He said the system had been optimizing for the order in which vehicles arrived when. The actual constraint was the order, which they needed to depart, identify. The right problem and the solution. Follows, I made a mental note to give him more responsibility as fast as he could absorb it. That kind of thing was happening everywhere in the facility. Every hour people identifying the actual problem, solving it, and moving to the next one, not because they had been told to, because that was what they had spent years learning to do. Somewhere in the conclave chamber, delegates from 40 species were debating response strategies and legal frameworks and the precise diplomatic language to be used. Informal communications to the breath, asking for cessation of hostilities. The breath was still moving. 2 more outer ring colony stations had flagged V-breath scout formations in their immediate vicinity. We did not have the time that diplomacy requires. A pilot named June Calloway found me late on the 3rd night. She was 38, former Navy combat aviation, with a slight permanent tension in her jaw that I had come to recognize as the tell of pilots who have made enough fast decisions in small cockpits that the decision-making posture has become structural. She had been flying commercial routes since her discharge and spending her free time in simulators because she had never found anything else that held her attention. The same way, she told me we had the numbers, the equipment, the fuel, and the routes. She told me we did not have formal authorization to cross into the active conflict zone. She asked me if we were waiting for it. I thought about the 4 amber eyes and the 3 seconds of silence. I thought about the comedy segments. I thought about Pella and the Aegis fleet and 47 million people who had answered a call that no official body had issued. I thought about Daniel Holt's wife packing his bag without complaint because she understood why he was going. I thought about Wallace Price sleeping 5 hours in a field cot solving a problem that had taken the official engineering teams 3 days to identify in him 1 night to resolve. No, I said. June nodded once with the expression of someone who has heard the answer. They acted and is already thinking about the next step and walked back to the flight coordination table. I messaged Drake, we move at 400. His reply arrived in under 10 seconds. Already loaded. I put down my communicator and stood in the quiet for 1 moment longer than I needed to, looking out through the long transparent panels in the upper wall at the orbital transit lanes, glowing against the dark. Civilian ships, retrofitted and crewed by people who had done this before under worse conditions. A galaxy that had laughed at 47 million veterans was about to discover the specific and very significant difference between a gesture and a truck machine. Outside, the new Cartagena night was cold and quiet. The city was sleeping. The people in it were living their lives, not knowing what was being assembled in the old warehouse at Dock 7 and the 37 other staging sites across the colony systems, not knowing that the thing the galaxy had laughed at was loading ammunition and running systems checks and going over contingency routes. 1 more time before the dawn. They did not need to know. That was the point. That had always been the point. I walked through the facility 1 more time before leaving. Percy Okafor's parking operation was still running smoothly, now being managed by 2 younger veterans he had trained in the previous hour. Philip Crane's medical intake section was processing people cleanly. Renee Booker's communications routing improvements were still holding. Wallace Price was asleep on a field cot in the corner of the planning room, his 3 notebooks on the floor beside him. The redesign that would let 47 million people actually deploy sitting inside. Them already being implemented 3,000 km. Above us, I picked up my kit, my knee. I did not stop. The breath did not expect us from 7 directions at the same time. That was intentional, and the design had come from an unlikely place. A retired Navy intelligence officer named Arthur Graves, who had been running a modest fishery on an outer agricultural moon for 3 years, and who had in the 36 hours following the emergency broadcast done essentially no sleeping and a great deal of very focused work using commercial shipping manifests and transit data that the Vreth had not bothered to monitor, because no recognized military force had ever used commercial cargo corridors to approach a combat engagement. Why would they? Serious adversaries used military transit routes. The Vreth had been fighting serious adversaries for 2,000 years and knew exactly how they moved. They had never fought us. I was aboard the converted freighter Resolute when we made our approach to the Pella system, the same system where the Aegis fleet had disengaged 6 weeks earlier. The Resolute had been carrying agricultural bulk cargo before June Calloway's team requisitioned it. The cargo bay held 3 combat drop units, 2 complete medical teams, and munitions stockpiled from 3 separate reserve locations. Across the outer colonies, the ship still carried the smell of what it had last transported, a warm, dusty grain scent that I found oddly grounding in. The hours before contact, our pilot was a man named Callum Perry, former Navy long-haul combat transport, 10 years of active service before his discharge. He had the particular stillness of someone who has been in enough genuinely dangerous situations to stop spending energy on things he cannot influence. When the first breath patrol formation appeared on long-range sensors, he adjusted heading by 4 degrees, said, "I see them," and kept his hands absolutely level. The breath defensive formation was exactly as their doctrine specified, layered, interlocking with overlapping coverage that left minimal unmonitored approach vectors. It was, by any objective analysis, a well-designed defensive structure built on 2,000 years of accumulated military knowledge about how adversaries move and where they are most likely to attempt penetration. It had been built to stop adversaries whose behavior could be predicted. June, Calloway's strike wing reached the outer system using 2 maneuvers that did not exist in any galactic tactical database, because June had invented them in the preceding 3 weeks during practice runs between transit points and had taught them to her pilots in sessions that the Breath's pre-conflict intelligence gathering had no record of. The Breath response to Jun and LT Unk and GT's initial contact was immediate, coordinated, and aimed at vectors that her wing was no longer occupying, because she had built her approach on the assumption that a 2,000-year-old military empire would respond according to its own doctrine, which it did, and she had already planned for what would need to happen. After that, this was the consistent pattern across every engagement in the first 2 weeks. But the pattern itself requires more than one example to understand fully. On the 5th day, a retired Army demolition specialist named Gordon Webb, who had spent 8 years running a civilian construction company since his discharge, led a small team in an operation against a VR communications relay that had been supporting their forward positioning. The standard approach to that kind of target was documented in conclave military manuals and took between 4 and 6 hours. Gordon's approach took 40 minutes. It used 3 techniques that the manual did not contain because the manual had been written by people who had not spent 8 years in civilian construction learning what certain materials do under certain conditions. The relay went dark. The breath section it had been supporting lost coordination for 11 hours. On the 7th day, a medic named Clara Weeks, who had served 6 years in the colonial defense and was now assigned to our forward medical network, solved a supply problem that had been cutting into our medical capacity by repurposing equipment from 3 different systems in a combination that no one had previously tried. She had not read it in a manual. She had worked it out during a 10-minute break because the problem had been bothering her and her brain had kept working on it whether or not she gave it permission. The solution held for the rest of the campaign. Multiply those 2 examples by 47 million people across 8 weeks. That was what the breath were facing. Not a single improvised approach that they could learn and counter. A continuous stream of improvised approaches from people whose individual creativity had been sharpened by years of service into something that their war modeling systems simply did not have the architecture to contain. The breath were not slow. Their doctrine was not flawed in any general sense. It was in fact optimally designed for the kind of adversary it had been developed against, an adversary with a formal command structure, established tactical protocols and behavior patterns that could be mapped from prior engagements and projected forward with high confidence. What it could not accommodate was an adversary whose operational decisions were being generated by 47 million individual veterans drawing on 47 million individual sets of operational experience, producing a collective behavior that had no single pattern to be learned and no centralized logic to be anticipated. You cannot model improvisation at scale. You can only encounter it and respond in real time. And responding in real time to something you have never encountered before at the speed of an active engagement is exactly the condition that 1700 years of methodical refinement had made the breath worst at. Owen Drake led a boarding action against a breath carrier that standard conclave protocol estimated at 3 to 4 hours. He completed it in 41 minutes using a modified approach that he had developed privately over the years since his discharge, after spending time reviewing what had failed in a standard boarding action he had participated in during the border campaign. He had never written the modification into any official document. It existed in his experience and in the experience of the people who had trained with him, and the breath had no record of it because there was no record for them to find. June Calloway flew 4 engagement runs in the first 3 days and invented a new maneuver on the 3rd run when the approach she had planned was partially blocked by breath formation shift she had not expected. She invented it in the air in real time, communicated it to her wing in the 40 seconds they had between identifying the problem and needing to act on it, and the wing executed it without a second practice run because they trusted her judgment, and they had trained together long enough to move on short notice the breath response patterns for the next 18 Ours were still aimed at countering the approach she had originally planned. Arthur Graves from his listening position in the outer system was reading breath communications throughout. He sent me condensed summaries at irregular intervals in his characteristic economy of language. His summary on the second day was their tactical communications are increasing in volume. Volume increase in command networks is what confusion looks like in their doctrine. His on the fourth day was, they have begun reassigning units to protect positions that were not under threat. This is what fear of unpredictability looks like. Each summary was 3 lines. Each one told me exactly what I needed to know. I ran operations from the Resolute and watched the engagement. Data arrived with the cold, settled clarity of a mind doing the work it was built for, not the sharp-edged alertness of a first engagement, something older and more certain, the particular focus of someone who has been doing a specific kind of work for a long time and knows exactly what the data means the moment. It appears we took losses. I will not move past this quickly because nothing in this account deserves to be moved past quickly, and the losses least of all. We took real losses. A team from the 4th drop unit hit a breath defensive countermeasure that our pre-engagement intelligence had not identified, and 6 people did not return. A transport shuttle from the Callisto contingent was caught in a coverage overlap during a resupply run and went down with 4 crew aboard. Woman named Helen Ford, who had spent 15 years as an Army combat medic, had come out of retirement specifically to staff one of our forward medical stations and was lost when the station took a direct impact during the 2nd day of the Pell engagement. I knew Helen Ford not closely but enough. She had a daughter on a mid-ring colony. Among the people who had served with her, she was known for a quality of absolute stillness in trauma situations that newer medics would sometimes mistake for emotional distance until they watched her work and understood that it was not distance at all. It was total focus, the kind that leaves nothing available for panic or hesitation. When the report came through, I sat with it for a moment, not long. You cannot stop in the middle of what is happening around you, but long enough to let it register in the part of the mind where these things are meant to register and stay registered, not as a weight to be managed, but as a truth to be acknowledged, because acknowledging the truth of a loss is the only form of respect that lasts beyond the moment of it. There were others whose names I added to the list that week, not in any official record in the private accounting that every veteran keeps, one with no formal ceremony, just the honest record of who came with you and who did not come back. You do not stop for each name in the middle of an operation because you cannot, but you add them and they stay added, and you carry the list forward for as long as you carry anything. I thought about the KET military advisor and her description of human emotional volatility, what she had called instability, what she had presented as a disqualifying characteristic was the exact opposite of what I was watching. June Calloway, flying 4 engagement runs with the same technical precision on the 4th as on the 1st, not because she had suppressed what she felt between them, but because what she felt made the precision non-negotiable. Eli Marsh, running his medical station for 36 straight hours, not because he was incapable of fatigue, but because the people coming through the door deserved. Everything he had, Owen Drake staying at. His logistics node through too near. Failures, not because he was unmoved by them, but because being moved by something is not the same as being stopped by it. That is what genuine commitment looks like from the inside. Not the absence of feeling, channeling of it into the work, completely without reservation, because the work and the feeling are not separate things, they are the same thing, expressed in two different forms. The Keth advisor had looked at that and called it a liability. The breath would spend the next 6 weeks discovering what it actually was. Vithal Nar was a breath. Commander, 612 years old, 9 previous conflicts and no prior experience of being captured. When Owen's team secured the command node and I walked in, the first thing that happened was that Vithal Nar looked at me with eyes that had seen 6 centuries of organized conflict and held in that moment something I had not expected to find in a senior VHT commander: genuine confusion, not fear. Not the performance of defiance, actual unguarded confusion, the expression of a mind that has encountered something outside its operational model and knows it. He asked through the wall-mounted translation unit why human fighters moved with such apparent disregard for their own continuation. I said that we were not disregarding it, that we were aware of it at every moment, that we had simply already reached an understanding with the possibility of losing it. He was quiet. You have lived 600 years, I said. On any given day of those 600 years, did you truly believe at the level where a person really believes things that you might not be alive by? The following morning, he did not answer. We believe that every time we go out. I said, we have believed it since the first week of training. That is not recklessness. It is a different relationship with time than you have. You have centuries to spend, so you plan in centuries. We have a career, maybe 20 good years of service with everything that matters compressed into them. We do not fight like we have centuries, because we do not have centuries. We fight like we have today, and we make today count. The translator hummed in the quiet. VTH. Kalnar lowered his head slightly in a way that the translator unit flagged as an expression somewhere in the range of acknowledgement, or what might in breath cultural terms be something close to respect offered to an adversary. Owen walked in, handed me a water container without speaking, and waited. I drank, handed it back, and returned to the situation table. We stood in silence for a moment, Vithal Nar and I on opposite sides of the room, outside the command node's viewport. The system was still active with movement, the conflict still running, still unresolved, still with weeks of difficult work ahead of it. But in that room, in that moment, there was something that felt like the simplest possible version of understanding, passing between two people from very different kinds of lives. He had looked at me and seen something that his model had not prepared him for. I had looked at him and seen what 600 years of certainty looks like when it encounters something it had not expected to encounter. I did not feel triumph. I felt the kind of tiredness that comes after a thing has been carried far enough to finally put down, mixed with the knowledge that there was still a long way to go. Thurvon the Conclave fleet scholar who had embedded with our unit at the start of the second week was standing near the far wall with his recording unit running. He had been running it continuously since his Arrival which I had noticed but not objected to because having a 300-year-old conclave intelligence analyst document what we were doing seemed likely to be useful eventually. He was taking notes in the margins of his recordings, small, quick annotations, and his expression was the consistent expression he had worn since his arrival, a person whose existing understanding of something important is being revised faster than the revision can be fully processed. He waited until V. Thalnar had been secured and the immediate post-capture protocols were running before he came to me. His recording unit was still active. He asked how human forces managed fear during sustained high-intensity operations. I thought about Helen Ford, calm in the middle of everything, every part of her focused on the person in front of her. I thought about 6 people from the 4th drop unit who had gone out and not come back. I thought about Owen Drake at 400 already loaded. Waiting, we do not manage it, I said. We use it. He wrote that down. He sent it to the Conclave High Council that same night, marked urgent. I did not find out until later that this single line had produced what was described in the Council's internal records as the first substantive reassessment of the human mobilization strategic implications. The engagement at Pella continued. Every day the data confirmed the same thing. In slightly different forms, the breath were encountering something their model did not account for, and the gap between what their model predicted and what was actually happening was growing wider rather than narrower. Arthur Graves was reading their communications from the outer system and sending me summaries in his characteristic economy of language. 3 lines when someone else would have written 3 pages, every word chosen with the precision of someone who has spent his career understanding that the most important information is the information you distill down to exactly what matters. His summary on the 4th day was they are trying to find the pattern. There is not one. They know there is not one. This is making them careful. Careful is slower. Careful and slower was exactly what we needed. The work continued. The losses continued. The forward progress continued. And somewhere in the outer system, a 340-year-old fleet scholar was running out of margins in his notebooks and beginning the long, difficult process of explaining to a galaxy full of ancient civilizations why the thing they had laughed at was the thing that was turning the tide of the first conflict in 2,000 years. To make the breath reconsider, Thurvan sent his first preliminary report to the Conclave High Council on the 9th day of the engagement. He showed me the summary before transmitting it. The central finding was 3 sentences. Human veterans do not fight the way long-lived species fight. They fight the way people fight when they know their time is limited and have decided to use it completely. This is not a tactical characteristic, it is a philosophical one, and it produces tactical results that no doctrine preparation fully anticipates. The High Council received that report and requested a full follow-up within the week. Thurvan told me this with the quietly satisfied expression of a researcher who has just been told his work is important. I told him to get some sleep before he wrote the full version. He said he would try. Neither of us believed him. The Conclave General Assembly went quiet when the first 30-day engagement report was formally presented, not the procedural quiet of a session being called to order, a different kind of quiet. The kind that falls in a room full of people who have held a confident assumption for a long time and have just been shown data that contradicts it in a way that is not subtle and cannot be reframed. 48 species of delegates representing civilizations whose combined institutional memory stretched back millennia, sitting in a chamber that had hosted 1,000 recorded debates about conflict and resolution and military strategy, and none of them finding an immediate thing to say. The breath Dominion had not been meaningfully stopped in an active conflict since their first documented campaign 1,700 years ago. In the past 30 days they had been stopped 3 times, not redirected through diplomatic channels, not slowed by negotiation, stopped, held under sustained pressure, and at the Pelleas system pushed back in a manner that the breath's own internal communications, which Arthur Graves had been quietly accumulating for 5 weeks, described as outside any precedent in their operational history. The KE military advisor, who had publicly declined humanity's offer of assistance, had been removed from her advisory role and replaced by a senior admiral named Sarevel, who was 300 years old, had served in 4 conflicts of his own, and had the particular quality of a person who was very experienced and has just encountered something that his experience did not prepare him for. He had requested an urgent operational briefing with our field command. He had also, through a separate channel, asked Thurvan to send him everything. Thurvan was sending him everything. In the 4 weeks since his arrival, Thurvan had produced over 300 pages of observation notes, supplemented by continuous audio and visual recordings and a running analytical commentary that he was updating daily. He had arrived with the kind of scholarly interest appropriate to observing an unusual military formation. What he had stayed with was something considerably more significant than that, and he was increasingly aware of the gap between what he had expected to find and what he was actually looking at. He came to me one evening while I was reviewing the preliminary approach data for what would become the decisive operation of the conflict. The planning center was fully occupied. Owen Drake at the logistics table, Nate Freeborn working through contingency variants with the focused intensity of someone who treats every possible failure mode as a personal challenge. June Calloway in the corner making small, precise marks on approach charts. Eli Marsh running a quiet skill session with 2 newer medics in the far corner with a patient attention of someone for whom teaching is not a secondary function but the natural expression of what he knows. Thurvan asked me how our people maintained performance under the kind of sustained operational stress that by the established medical and psychological models of every conclave species he was aware of should have produced measurable degradation in decision-making quality and emotional regulation by now. I told him he was looking for degradation because his models predicted it, and that the better question was what the baseline actually was. These people have been training inside stress their entire careers, I said, not preparing for stress as an anticipated future condition, training in it as an ongoing present reality. The conflicts they came from were not interruptions in otherwise stable service, they were the service. The condition your models call high-intensity sustained stress is the condition they were selected for and built for and have spent their careers functioning inside. When you ask how They are maintaining performance under these conditions. You are asking the wrong question. The correct question is, what are they like when the conditions are easy? Thuron considered this for a moment and then asked what I thought they were like in easy conditions. Restless, I said, honestly restless. And a little lost. The quiet is harder for most of us than the work, he wrote that down in the margins of his recording notes, which had run out of margin space several days earlier and were now being written on the backs of the pages. He asked after a pause whether I thought the conclave could develop this quality in its own forces. Not the tactical skills which he acknowledged were teachable, but the underlying disposition, the willingness to show up and keep going and carry the weight of what you carry without letting it stop you. I thought about that honestly, because it was a question that deserved an honest answer rather than a flattering one. Some of it, I said, the tactical improvisation, the self-organization, the willingness to solve problems without waiting to be told, those can be trained with the right program and enough time in genuinely difficult conditions. But the deeper thing, the thing that produced 47 million people answering a call that nobody required them to answer, I do not know if that can be trained. I think it might have to be lived. Thurvan was quiet for a long moment, then he asked whether I thought it came from the short lives, whether the awareness of mortality was the source of it. I said I did not think it was the mortality itself. I thought it was what the mortality had made us build, because you know your time is limited. You cannot afford to spend it on things that are not real, because you know what loss actually cost. You take the things worth protecting more seriously, because you have already faced the question of what you are willing to give and answered it once. Answering it again does not require a long deliberation. You have had 400 years to prepare for this question. I said we have about 40, and the people in this room answered it. Thurvan wrote for a long time after that. Without speaking, he came back the following morning with a specific question. He wanted to understand the mechanism by which the informal planning network we had built produced results that the conclave's formal planning systems had not as a critique, as a genuine attempt to understand the architecture of what he was observing. I told him in the formal planning systems were optimized to produce consistent outcomes against modeled scenarios. Consistency requires constraints. Constraints reduce the solution space. Reduce it far enough and you produce results that an adversary can learn to anticipate, because all constrained systems eventually converge on a limited range of outputs. What we had done instead was build a planning process with no constraints other than whether a given solution would work, and populated it with people whose combined experience covered more problem types than any single doctrine could contain. The outputs were unpredictable because the inputs were genuinely diverse, and they were effective because every contributing person had tested their knowledge against real situation. Being wrong had real consequences. Thuron considered that and then said, with the careful cadence of someone who has spent 3 centuries being precise about definitive statements and is now making one anyway, that he believed this was the most significant thing he had ever been asked to document in his career. I did not know what to say to that, so I went back to my planning table. Saravel sent a direct message to Our field command the same afternoon. Brief and precise, the conclave joint. Intelligence Secretariat was updating its formal assessment of the human mobilization and wish to be informed of significant developments directly, not through the standard reporting chain. I took that as confirmation that the galaxy was beginning to pay attention in the right way. The operation we were building had been assembled over 6 days by a collection of veterans with different specialties contributing their best individual thinking to a shared planning space without a formal hierarchy determining whose ideas took precedence and without any single doctrinal framework constraining what solutions were acceptable to propose. The operation planning process ran for 6 days. I have been asked to describe it formally, and I have never been able to do it justice in formal terms because it was not a formal process. It was more like a long conversation between people who had each spent years thinking about how to do things better and had finally been given a room and a problem and told to go. Nate Freeborn ran the room. He was 29 and had 2 years of service and 8 years of civilian logistics experience and the specific quality of mind that can hold many moving pieces simultaneously without losing track of how they relate to each other. He did not tell people what to contribute. He asked questions. He asked Gordon Webb what the single most important thing he had learned about demolitions in civilian construction was, and Gordon answered, and Nate listened, and 20 minutes later that answer was in the plan. He asked June Calloway what the most common mistake she saw pilots make when an approach went wrong, and June answered, and the plan was adjusted to address it. He asked Arthur Graves what the brief communication patterns suggested about where their command structure was most exposed, and Arthur produced a 3-line answer that was worth more than 100 pages of formal intelligence analysis. The result was 17 interlocking operational elements, each one addressing a specific tactical problem, each one designed by different person drawing on a different body of experience. A retired Navy demolition specialist named Gordon Webb had worked out the supply interdiction approach. Arthur Graves had identified the sensor coverage gaps in the outer system that nobody had thought to look for because they were in a commercial transit corridor. June had designed the strike routing with 3 alternatives built in from the first draft because June had learned long ago that her first route was the one she used when everything went as planned and nothing went as planned. Nate Freeborn had assembled all of it into a single coherent operational plan and then spent 2 full days running it against every failure scenario he could construct, asking the questions about what happens when each element encounters its worst case and how the adjacent elements respond. When he presented the final version, it was not elegant in the way that formal military planning documents aim for elegance. It was dense and cross-referenced and annotated in 3 different colors of ink, and it was, as far as I could determine after 22 years of operational work, as close to right as anything I had seen. Arthur Graves sent 1 line the morning the operation began. They are looking for the pattern. Tell them there is not one. I passed that to every unit lead and told them to keep it in mind. There is a thing that happens in the early hours of a major operation when the planning is over and the execution has begun, and the situation is no longer something you can adjust with a pencil on a chart. Everything that was preparation becomes real. Every contingency you built becomes either something you will need or something you will be glad you prepared even though you did not need it. Every decision made in the quiet of a planning session gets tested against the living situation, which is always different from the version you planned for, and the difference is always the thing that matters most. The breath responded to the first elements of our operation the way their doctrine specified, precisely, methodically, with the confidence of a force that had done this many times before and knew exactly what to do. What their doctrine did not account for was that we had already planned for their response, and that our plan for what came next was one that their systems had no model for, because it was not derived from any doctrine that had ever faced them before. It was derived from the combined experience of 17 different veterans who had between them fought in 9 different conflicts across 4 decades and had in the past 6 days sat in the same room and contributed the best of what they knew. Arthur Graves, from the outer system, watched their command communications in real time. He sent updates in his characteristic 3-line format every few hours. The second update said, "Response pattern is nominal. They are doing exactly what they were trained to do. This is the last time that will help them." The third said, "Command traffic increasing. This means they are working harder than usual to maintain coherence. Coherence problems in breath doctrine lead to over-centralization. Over-centralization leads to slower decisions. Slower decisions lead to our advantage growing with every hour." He was right. The operation ran for 47 hours. I will not pretend I remember all of it with equal clarity, because sustained operations at that level produce a particular relationship with time, where some moments are burned in with the sharpness of full alertness and others blur into the continuous forward movement of getting the next thing done. What I remember clearly: June strike, wing adapting to changed breath positioning in real time, discarding the primary route and switching to variant 2 so smoothly that the enemy response tracking did not catch up for over an hour. Owen Drake running simultaneous resupply chains for units on opposite ends of the engagement zone from a command node that had been a commercial communications hub 48 hours earlier, holding both chains functional through 2 moments that a less experienced logistics commander would have called irrevocable, and that Owen resolved through direct personal improvisation that he could not have written down if asked, because it came from somewhere below the level of explicit knowledge. Gordon Webb supply interdiction worked on the 31st hour. The breath logistics hub that had been sustaining their advance fragmented faster than the timeline had projected, because the approach had been designed to be completely unrecognizable to their defensive systems, which it was. Arthur Graves sent 3 words: "It is done." I will tell you the moment I remember most clearly from those 47 hours, because it was not a tactical moment and it was not the moment the operation succeeded. It was a moment in the forward medical station late in the second day, when Eli Marsh was running on a bright-eyed through a procedure. Eli had been on shift for over 30 hours. Anna was tired and stressed, and her stress was showing in small mechanical errors, the kind a person makes when part of their attention is occupied by awareness that they might be making errors. Eli was correcting each one with the same patient, specific attention. explaining the reason behind the correct method each time rather than simply naming the correction, treating each error as useful information about what needed to be understood more fully. That was the thing, a person under genuine at the end of a very long shift who could have simply issued corrections and moved on, fixed, choosing instead to make sure that the person he was working with came out of the moment knowing more that she had known going in. That was what 47 million veterans had brought, not just operational skill, the quality of character that forms in people who have been genuinely tested and chosen consistently to become better rather than harder, the capacity to keep giving something to the people around you even when you are running close to empty yourself. I was injured in the final phase, a pressure wave from a containment failure in the adjacent section caught me against a structural support, 2 cracked ribs, knee re-injured in the way it had been re-injured twice before and would now require actual surgery to address. I was on the floor for approximately 90 seconds before Owen appeared, took one look at the situation with the expression of someone who is not surprised and moved me to the medical station in a manner that left no room for discussion about whether I was capable of walking there independently. I finished the operation from a cot, which was undignified but functional. June Calloway filed her post-operation report 6 hours after the final engagement. It was 2 paragraphs, precise and complete. 40 minutes after filing it, she submitted a request for her next assignment. She did not wait for the operation's full results to be compiled. She did not wait for any recognition to be formally processed. She was already looking at what came next. Thurvon watched her submit that request and immediately wrote something in his notes. He showed me later he had written, "She has just completed what will likely prove to be the most significant individual combat contribution of this conflict. She is already looking for the next assignment. This is not ambition in any conventional sense. This is the purest expression of the human veteran disposition that I have observed. The complete inability to be finished, not because there is always more to achieve, but because the work is what they are and stopping is not something they have a native concept for. A formal communication arrived from the Conclave High Council 4 days later. It included, somewhat unexpectedly, a physical arrangement of pressed botanical specimens that I was informed represented in Keth cultural tradition the acknowledgement of a debt. Attached message was brief and careful, and said in the measured language of institutions admitting significant error. We were mistaken in our initial assessment of your capacity. We are grateful I kept the message. Some acknowledgements deserve to be kept, not as trophies, as records, as part of the honest account of what things cost and what they produced. The Verith Dominion signed the armistice on the 42nd day of the engagement, which was the first armistice they had signed in 2,000 years of recorded military history. Their strategic doctrine had no framework for it, not in the abstract theoretical sense, the way a doctrine might lack a specific tactical protocol that could be developed and added at the fundamental level, at the level of what the doctrine was built on and what it assumed about the world. An armistice was not a concept. Their military planning infrastructure had been designed to accommodate every conflict in breadth. History had ended in total victory or total destruction. Those were the only categories that existed. The idea of stopping, of choosing not to finish what had been started, of stepping back from an active engagement that had not reached its final resolution. This required them to build a new framework from nothing while the engagement was still ongoing, which is not the kind of thing that a 2,000-year-old military institution does easily or quickly. They did it anyway. The conclave scholars, who would later study this period, spent considerable effort constructing an explanation. Their official analysis used the phrase strategic recalibration in response to unexpected force dynamics, which was accurate in the way that saying a building has been demolished is accurate, technically correct, and not the whole story. The breadth internal communications which Arthur Graves had been accumulating from his listening position in the outer system, and which were eventually released through the transparency terms of the armistice agreement, were more specific. VTH High Command had classified human forces as non-modelable in their operational assessments, a category that had not previously existed in their military taxonomy, and that they had created specifically to describe something their prediction systems could not resolve. They had tried repeatedly to build a behavioral model from the engagement data, and the model kept failing because the human forces were not operating from a single unified doctrine that could be learned and projected forward. They were operating from 47 million individual people making decisions based on 47 million individual sets of experience. And the synthesis of all of that was something that no predictive system designed to model conventional military behavior had been built to contain. You cannot plan against something you cannot predict. The breath had spent 2,000 years being the most patient, most methodical, most strategically sophisticated military force in settled space. Every adversary they had ever encountered had been in one way or another modelable. We were the first adversary that was not. The 47 million went home. The formal armistice signing session was attended by conclave representatives and of breadth diplomatic delegation that had never previously participated in a session of this kind, because this kind of session had never previously been necessary. Sorevel, the Keth admiral who had replaced the original military advisor, attended as an observer. I was told later that he had not spoken during the session, that he had sat at the back of the chamber and watched, and that his expression, which Thurvon described in his notes, was the expression of a person who was updating a very large number of assumptions at the same time, and doing it without any visible complaint. Conrad Haley, the young ambassador who had raised his hand in that first emergency session and been politely declined, represented humanity. At the armistice table, he did not look like the least experienced person in the room anymore. He looked like someone who had spent 6 weeks learning very quickly, which he had, and who would carry what he had learned for the rest of what was likely to be a very long and significant career. I did not know him well enough to say this to him too directly. I noted it privately as one of the outcomes I had not anticipated and was glad to have seen. There was no single organized ceremony, no grand formal conclusion. Some units received formal recognition from the conclave, and a small number of those recognitions were marked by the kind of ceremony that gets recorded in official histories. Most people went home the way they had come, without Particular announcement on whatever. Transport was available and heading the right direction back to the same apartments and the same jobs and the same quiet lives they had stepped away from when an old frequency on an old broadcast band reached them and they recognized it. Percy Ockefer went back to his construction coordination work. Gloria Sands returned to her construction site, presumably retrieved her hard hat from wherever it had ended up after she set it on the intake table at Dock 7 and went back to supervising concrete pours. Wallace Price, who had redesigned the orbital staging platform in 3 notebooks over one sleepless night, returned to whatever an 81-year-old retired engineer does with the rest of his time, having solved a problem that the professional engineers with official positions and current credentials had not solved, and apparently having no particular need for anyone to make a formal note of it. The Conclave Security Council sent a formal commission offer within a week of the armistice with a title and a structure that would have put me in a senior advisory role with the newly reconstituted colonial defense framework they were building. The Earth Colonial Defense Command sent a separate and more personal request through Conrad Haley, who had spent the conflict doing the patient, unglamorous diplomatic work of representing humanity in a body that had just discovered it had been significantly wrong about us, and who had done it with considerably more grace than I would have managed in his position. I declined both, not because the work was not important, because I was 44 years old with 2 healing ribs and a knee that was going to need real surgery, actual reconstruction, not another partial repair that would hold for a decade and then require attention again, because 22 years was a complete answer to the question of how much I owed. Because Nate Freeborn did not need me, he was already running 3 parallel planning operations in the week after the armistice, building the architecture for a standing colonial reserve that had not previously existed, and that was going to be something genuinely new if the people building it were given room to build it without the older generation hovering. Give Nate 18 months and he would have produced something that none of us from my generation could have designed precisely, because he was not constrained by how things had previously been done. Owen Drake was back on his cargo routes. Within 2 weeks, I received a message from him on the morning of his first commercial run after the armistice. It said cargo delivered, route clear. I smiled at that for a long time because it was pure Owen Drake, 2 sentences, both of them saying everything that needed to be said, not a word wasted. John Calloway accepted a position with the newly established Colonial Flight Reserve, which the Conclave had agreed to formally recognize and support as part of the armistice terms. She was developing the training curriculum 3 days into the process. According to mutual contacts, she had discarded the existing framework and started from a blank page, which was the right decision and absolutely consistent with June's understanding of what it means to build something that will actually work. Arthur Graves returned to his fishery. His message to me was 6 words: fish survived. Records filed with Intel. That was Arthur. He had run a covert signals intelligence operation from an agricultural station for 6 weeks, collected thousands of intercepts that would inform Conclave strategic analysis for years, and his follow-up report amounted to half a sentence confirming that the relevant files were in the appropriate hands, Eli Marsh went back to his paramedic work on the third ring. He sent me a photograph 2 months after. Returning home, he was standing in a civilian hospital corridor in his work clothes, same posture, same rolled sleeves, with the same quality of settled alertness that had been his constant characteristic in the forward station. He was smiling in a way that changed his entire face, and it made me realize I had never seen him smile before. Not in 6 weeks of working alongside him through conditions that did not leave much room for it. He looked like a person exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to be doing. I kept that photograph. Dervan's full report was classified for 60 days following the armistice, when the conclave declassified and published it through their official academic network. It became within 3 months the most widely distributed document in the conclave's 200-year publication history, 400 language translations, academic adoption across 30 species. Freedom is incorporating it into core doctrine, curriculum, a breadth scholarly institution in what was described by Galactic Media as an unprecedented act of post-conflict intellectual engagement, formally requested permission to translate and distribute it within their own educational system. The final paragraph was the one that traveled furthest and was quoted most widely in the most contexts by the most different kinds of people and institutions. When I read it for the first time, alone on my balcony in New Cartagena, with my knee wrapped and elevated on the railing rail, in the sky doing its evening color change from orange through orange-red to the deep blue I had spent 6 weeks away from, I sat with it without doing anything else for a long time. He wrote, "Human veterans do not constitute a conventional military asset, as conclave strategic doctrine has historically defined that category. They are not soldiers who have aged beyond operational peak and are attempting to reoccupy a function that no longer fits them. They are something more specific than that, and I will admit that I lacked adequate language for it when I arrived, and have spent considerable effort developing language for it since. They are people who have already paid the full cost of the commitment they made, who understand with complete precision what that cost is because they experienced it personally, and who have chosen, when called, to pay it again. No other known species has demonstrated this at scale. It is not instinct, not the product of political structure or institutional programming. It is a decision made individually and collectively by people who had every reasonable right to choose differently, to spend what they had on something larger than themselves. The conclave failed to recognize this. We mistook the surface characteristics, the short lives, the strong emotions, the improvised methods for the substance, and the substance was the opposite of what we assumed. We were looking at the most complete expression of voluntary commitment that any documented civilization has ever produced. That is not a military capability, though it generates one. It is a philosophy of life expressed in action. We should not have laughed. We will not make that error again. The conclave's military registry added a new classification. After the armistice, Tier 1 Marshal species, the category had not previously existed. The Criteria Committee had struggled considerably with the formal language because what they were attempting to define was not expressible in the conventional terms of firepower, indices or strategic reach or doctrinal sophistication ratings. What they eventually settled on was demonstrate capacity for sustained voluntary commitment under asymmetric conditions, at scale which was as close as formal institutional language could get to what they were actually trying to say. 1. Species met the criteria. A message arrived from Bwin, who had served alongside me for 4 years and whom I had seen at Dock 7 on the first morning of the muster, standing in the intake line with 2 men I recognized immediately as his sons, both veterans, all 3 of them holding the same quality of quiet, settled readiness that their years of service had put into their posture, all 3 of them there because the frequency had reached them, and they had come independently and together because that is what the N-Win family apparently does. Bow's message had no words attached to it, just a photograph, he and his 2 sons at a lake near their home colony, fishing. Rods out, the sun low and flat at the edge of the frame. All 3 of them looking at the water rather than at the camera because nobody had warned them that the picture was being taken. Plain clothes and ordinary morning in the ordinary life that all 3 of them had come back to. I set that photograph as the primary display on my communicator and did not change it for the next 2 years. People asked me throughout the months that followed what we had wanted in return for what we had done. Journalists asked it, conclave. Researchers asked it, young people who had not served and were trying to understand the decision that 47 million people had made asked it in different ways that all came down to the same question: what did you expect to get from this? The honest answer, the one I gave every time and that I knew every veteran I had served with would recognize as true, was the only thing any of us had ever actually wanted. I wanted the people who came with me to be okay. Most of them were Owen Drake on his cargo routes, June Calloway building something new from a blank page. Nate Freeborn with 3 operations running simultaneously, and the particular energy of someone who has finally found the right scale for what they are capable of. Eli Marsh in a hospital corridor with his sleeves rolled up, smiling the way a person smiles when they are exactly where they belong. Bound when fishing with his sons on an ordinary morning. Helen Ford was gone. The 6 from the 4th drop unit were gone, 4 crew from the Callista shuttle, others whose names I carry the way veterans carry names, not as memories you schedule visits to, but as a permanent weight in a specific part of you, always there, no heavier or lighter, depending on the day, just present. They are supposed to be present. Not remembering them would be the failure. Not the remembering, but most of the 47 million went home. That was enough. It had always been enough, the same enough. It was the first day I enlisted, when I was young enough to think service was about something dramatic, and the enough it had become through 22 years of learning what service actually is, the daily decision to show up and do the necessary thing and carry what needs to be carried and keep going. I sat on my balcony in New Cartagena and watched the evening come in. The knee was healing slowly, which the surgeon said was normal for the extent of the repair, which I accepted because I was no longer in a hurry. The sky went through its 5 orange shades the way it always did and settled into the deep blue I had looked at through the window of my apartment for 3 years and briefly missed. with a specific and physical quality. When I was away from it, the orbital transit lanes began to glow as the night shift came on, thin, bright threads. Against the darkening sky below, the city was settling into its evening routines, the particular rhythm of a place where most people do not know what went into the quiet they are living in, and do not need to know, and that is the whole point. The galaxy had looked at us and laughed. It had decided that the short lives and the strong feelings and the improvised methods and the messiness of what we are were weaknesses were. Disqualifiers were evidence that we could not be taken sincerely as a force in a conflict that needed cold calculation and long perspectives. What it had missed was that every single thing it laughed at was exactly the thing that won the short lives, because we understood that the time you have is the time you use, and we used every hour of ours, the strong feelings, because the strength of what you are willing to do is inseparable from the depth of what you care about, and we cared with everything we had, the improvised methods, because improvisation at the level we practiced, it was not the absence of discipline. It was discipline applied to the actual situation rather than to the theoretical situation, and the actual situation is always different from the theoretical one, and the gap between them is where wars are decided. The galaxy revised its opinion. That revision took the form of official documents and new classifications, and Thurvan's report and the armistice terms, and all the formal institutional language that old civilizations used to acknowledge change. That was fine. That was what institutions do. We had not done it for the revision. The stars were fully out now, the way they only are when you sit still long enough to let your eyes adjust and the ambient light stops competing. Out there 40 systems of a 2,000-year empire were doing the slow work of figuring out what comes after. The first war they have ever decided not to finish. Out there the conclave was reorganizing its strategic frameworks and its military classifications and its assumptions about which species were worth taking seriously. Out there 4,000 inhabited worlds were processing the specific surprise of a thing they dismissed, turning out to be the thing that held the line. I was sitting on my balcony with a healing knee and a cold cup of something I had stopped drinking an hour ago, and I was not in a hurry to go anywhere or do anything, and the evening was doing what evenings do, and the 47 million were home, most of them, and the ones who were not were carried in the way they were supposed to be carried, and the work that needed doing had been done. My neoct, I did not care even. And